Thanks very much for having me on, Randy. I think the brief background I can give on myself is that by day I'm a private equity investor. I have a private equity fund that invests in South Africa, based in Cape Town. And by qualification, I'm an actuary, although I never worked as an actuary for a day in my life. It was probably a misguided choice of career for a young man like me. But I ended up very happy in private equity. And because I ran my own firm independent, and that's an important part of the story, I was not answerable to anybody. And when the looming specter of lockdowns emerged, a whole lot of alarm bells went off in my head. And being comfortable with data and analytics and risk constructs, I began to look at it as a question, this whole COVID phenomenon, and consult with experts from other professions. I have a friend who's an immunologist, a legal friend and an economics friend, and another actuary who I began speaking to very early on. This was like in the early weeks when lockdowns were first being touted. And when South Africa locked down, ours was a special one. We didn't do 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Ours was 3 weeks to flatten the curve. And when that 3 weeks came and went and they renewed the lockdown, I felt that it was something was fishy and that I needed to speak out. And so I joined social media, pulled together this group of 5 who'd by then grown to about 12 people who'd had, what we found was that people who were unconnected had come to exactly the same conclusions based on similar analytics or perspectives. But they'd done so independently, and that's a very powerful kind of thing to encounter. You meet somebody on social media you haven't met before, never heard of, and you see that they're saying exactly the same thing that you're saying, and they've never heard of you. And so what we did was we produced a paper. It was very difficult at the beginning to work out how to attack this beast, because the lockdowns they were almost woke. You couldn't speak out against a lockdown because people loved the lockdown, terrified of the virus. And so you had to be careful how you approached it. And so we said, look, we should be doing a cost-benefit analysis. Where's the cost-benefit analysis? We think that lockdowns, though they may well save lives with respect to the virus, will also cost lives because of their impact on the economy. The economy mediates life, and it's well known that impacts on people's livelihoods and incomes have a mortality impact. And that's one thing I had remembered from actuarial science, was that mortality and income are very closely related things. So working with an actuary by the name of Peter Castleton, we pulled together a paper called Quantifying the Years of Life Lost to Lockdown, which reversed the direction of flow of some pretty standard industry insurance mathematics to try and estimate the mortality impact that locking down would have. And we published that paper in an effort to stimulate a discussion around the cost-benefit analysis of lockdown. We were at that stage the first people to do that publicly anywhere in the world. We thought we were the first altogether, but it later turned out that several governments around the world had done similar analyses, coming to similar conclusions, and that when those conclusions came out against the notion of lockdowns, they simply buried the research. That was a particularly shocking thing for us to discover. And it highlighted the extent to which lockdowns, and indeed the whole COVID phenomenon, is not a public health or medical problem. It's a political, it needs to be understood as a political phenomenon. Been fairly clear on that from the beginning. This rush to consult public health people and doctors whenever anybody's got a question about the COVID phenomenon is understandable, but it's misplaced. You ought to be discussing this with political scientists and theoreticians of propaganda and
I mean,
And
the root word for public health is publius, which is the people, which is the same root word as politics, and they deal with the people. It is kind of an amazing thing. Public health officials had some schooling, but I think most of the schooling they got is in accord with the other use, the secondary use of the term when fish school. That is to say, they all work in cohesion and kind of like a single organism. They seem to have followed some preordained script right from the get-go. I think that having everybody on board with this all at once, and those who weren't were kind of whacked and mocked and so forth in order to get them in line with some. It seemed to be a little bit of a preordained plan for this virus, which didn't necessarily fit with the actual virus's characteristics.
Yeah, 100%. The plan was preordained, and it just, people focus a lot of attention on the famous event 201 from, I think it was August or September of 2019, at which plans to censor critics of the public health reaction, plans to censor critics of vaccines, etc., were painstakingly discussed and characterized as misinformation, this concept of misinformation. But that was not the first. It was, in fact, one of many such events stretching over several decades, where members of industry, government, and intelligence agencies gathered together to discuss doing a range of things that did not appear in any of the guidelines of public health of any country anywhere on the planet. In fact, they were often contraindicated by public health guidelines.
Yeah, it seems like there's been a whole reordering.
Yeah.
Who organized this conference? Who were the attendants and attendees?
I can't remember the detailed list of attendants because it's been some time since I actually consulted the recordings. So there's a transcript out, and it's easier to go and flick through that. But the Johns Hopkins University was involved. Melinda Gates Foundation was involved, and there were representatives from a variety of medical schools, of governments, of the Department of Defense, CIA, World Health Organization. Chinese government had a representative. I believe it was there was some of the groundwork laid there, but that is insufficient as an explanation. There was clearly planning that went on elsewhere, and that we have not yet uncovered, because we all know that these things rolled out as in a kind of lockstep fashion. This wasn't limited to sort of instances where one country imitates another. We had, one politician imitates the wording of another politician. We also had lockstep censorship around the world of critics of lockdown. So there was something centralized and slightly creepy going on. And of course, that's continued throughout the COVID phenomenon, because whenever people have spoken out, promoting whatever it may be, early treatment, or going against mask mandates, or criticizing the clinical trials of the so-called vaccines, this kind of blanket censorship has been the response. And it's been coordinated. It's been more or less global, at least in the Western world. And so, I agree with your sentiment.
I don't want to take us too far off track, but I think an undercovered episode is the 2003 SARS. SARS, it's like World War I. They didn't know it was SARS-1, so they just called it SARS. The aftermath within China. I mean, it was a different China then. Maybe in some ways similar, but it was much like there was no social media, and there wasn't quite the outlook in, or the in look out that we could follow things going on as easily. But apparently there were riots. I can't remember which city, but some not Shanghai, not Beijing, but some major cities, New York City sized cities, wherein there were forced migrations or forced expulsions of people based on illness, and so other people were literally revolting, and this I think left an indelible mark on the Chinese Politburo, whatever they have there, leaders, that viruses and response can be danger. And so rather than go the opposite way of not trying to do forced expulsions or not trying to lock people down, I think they had this concept of doing it even better, so there would not be the repercussions. Kind of like, there has not been a Tiananmen Square, in the succeeding 20, 30 years, whatever. And I understand that Bloomberg is tied in with Johns Hopkins, School of Public Health, and the Gates Foundation has its own issues and so forth. I don't know how they all kind of, I grew up reading Superman and Batman comics, and Bruce Wayne was kind of the, I suppose, like the Bloomberg figure, very wealthy and erudite and whatnot. But in the comics, they're all trying to do good. Here it seems as if, some of our wealthies have conspired with a concept that was inimical to the way they got their wealth in the first place. That's a little bit of a diatribe. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but can I
just pick up on China? Nothing about the early Chinese experience makes any sense at all in light of what we now know. So there was some kind of propaganda projected out of China, or at least, sorry, let me catch myself there. There was propaganda about China. It's not clear how much of it was sourced from Western intelligence agencies and how much of it was sourced from the CCP. But the story that is told about China and what happened with the emergence of COVID, the introduction of lockdowns, and their curves of cases and deaths is wholly implausible. And it just simply is not possible. So I don't think it will be soon at all when we can actually say what went on there. It's going to take some time. My sense is that there was very much a theatrical element to it all. If any of your listeners have read Michael Singer's book, Snake Oil, the story of how Xi Jinping shut down the world, you'll get an interesting perspective there. And so I urge people in general to be skeptical about the stories of Wuhan and the lab leaks and all that kind of thing. The stories of the efficacy of lockdown in China are now obviously false. And so, I'm just deeply skeptical. And you said, SARS-1, they didn't know that they had to call it SARS-1 because at that stage it had just been SARS. Well, actually, the International Committee of Viral Taxonomy came out and said they effectively were saying this is SARS. This is an individuum of SARS. They used that term in the paper, and an individuum is something that doesn't even get qualified to be named as a species or anything like that. It's not really a new virus. This is an old virus, right. No novel virus.
Right.
And that paper was kind of, first they forced an edit, and then they buried the old version. That happened very early on in the game.
Mm-hmm. Well, SARS is really, it's kind of like the HIV AIDS. AIDS is the descriptive term for the HIV as the virus. So in this case, SARS is the descriptive term, sudden adult respiratory syndrome.
And the virus gets its name from the syndrome.
Yeah.
And now we have
the virus. Obviously, it was a coronavirus, just so forth. Yeah. So, coronavirus would be the HIV term, the actual virion.
Yes.
But I think, SARS-1 is kind of a mystery, shrouded in an enigma, wrapped up in a conundrum, to kind of paraphrase Churchill. But I'm going to leave that aside. Let's just maybe fast forward to where I guess our stream left off. Nick Hudson, Pandata. What has been the pathway of Pandata? What has been, the recognition? Where do you stand now? What are the trials, and what have you learned along the way?
Well, we stayed focused on lockdowns for quite some time, even though our concerns had spread into other areas. So, for example, at the beginning, we thought the mask mandates were idiotic affairs, and that their presence gave us concerns that there might be a broader political agenda in play. And we began broadening out the membership to include people who could look at that. We also became aware of the behavioral science manipulations that were in play, and we set up a group to study that. From the beginning, we emphasized taking a multidisciplinary approach. I'm very critical of the work that's done by virology groups, doctors groups, public health groups. It's a bad idea to put experts of the same type in a room and tell them to come up with explanations for what's going on in a complex world. It just doesn't ever produce anything of value to man or beast.
Yeah,
very often the doctors want to see everything as a medical problem, and in the argument that I would make is that COVID is first and foremost a political problem and has very minor medical and clinical.
Well, I agree with you. There's an old joke about democracy being three wolves and a sheep voting on dinner, and when you have a bunch of people in that particular expertise, they're going to vote according to their. It's like the other joke is, to a carpenter everything looks like a nail, or to a hammer everything looks like a nail, and to public health people, I mean, this is kind of their beauty moment. There's another silly joke, which is that politics is Hollywood for ugly people, and they have some of the similar aspirations. And when they get their moment in the sun, and they're getting their Warholian 15 minutes of fame, and presumably fortune as well, because fortune tends to follow fame these days, monetized and whatnot. Back 1,000 years ago when I was in medical school, one of my professors, his buddy was an expert on one of the stands. I think it was Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or whatever. And when the Soviet Union, just a few years after, was dissolving, he was on TV, because they trotted him out, and he was great, grateful, and he was interested, and he was, all over the place talking about how one stand differs from another, Tajikistan, this, and so he had his moment in the sun. A lot of, I think, academics, toil away dealing with long named, molecules and so forth, and then now they are, the tail essentially wagging the dog, and I think that its power is an intoxicant, and people don't want to release it. And I completely agree that this was a global. Well, I don't mean the Earth. I mean, it was an encompassing affair that needed to have considerations of philosophic differences, of actuarial, economic calculations, because clearly the fallout has been enormous and has affected people who were not really at risk for the virus itself.
Yeah, you need psychological, sociological, ecological insights. In fact, some of the most useful people inside Panda, certainly from my perspective, in terms of orienting my thinking and helping me to understand why certain aspects of the claimed narrative cannot be true, have been ecologists. That they have this very systems-like view of complex phenomena, and
I think we both have one favorite one in mind.
Yes, we do. To me, the questions that they ask are so intriguing compared to the ones that the virologists and doctors often ask. So why would we be in a situation where there's a huge niche left in the biosphere? In other words, surely over the billions of years that they've had roaming the planet, viruses have occupied every conceivable ecological niche. Why do we all expect the emergence of a novel virus jumping out of a bat and killing everybody? This must have happened billions of times in the past. There are lots of bats, lots of people, lots of virions.
Exactly. And I think that there are some basic principles I think that you've hewed to and somewhat inform my own sensibilities about this, which is that likely So the example I continually trot out, and I apologize if you heard it, is wolves and dogs. Wolves and our current dogs have some common ancestor. So there's an ancient proto-wolf that led to each. And so if you have a little Pekingese or a Schnauzer or whatever, back in the past, and ditto the coyote and so forth, they all have some, Wolfian predecessor. But the current wolves, they don't really care. They don't care about us. Their own ecosystem and food and whatnot. They have a sanctuary, so they can tear away some child from I don't know, a garden and run off into the woods and eat the child. The dingo ate my baby kind of thing, and they don't have any repercussions around ramifications. The Schnauzer can't get away with that, and the Schnauzer depends on us in a different way. So the example, just to kind of shorten it a little bit, is that some kind of like wild virus doesn't, like Ebola, say, doesn't have humans as a sanctuary and a reservoir, and can come in and do its obliteration, and doesn't really, in a sense, care the same way a cold virus does. Cold viruses need us to be upright and walking and talking in order to pass along. So there's an attenuation as one goes from the wolf to becoming a domesticated pet, that there's a kind of a, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. And so the cold viruses that don't have an animal sanctuary. So when a coronavirus goes from the wild and winds up only being amongst humans, it has to self-attenuate, because if it kills you, it doesn't get to pass along. So it's kind of the Ebola principle, that Ebola burns brightly but disappears, and we keep hearing about, oh my God, Ebola is going to take over. There's a horrible flesh-eating virus, but it doesn't happen because humans react to the virus itself. So it's a little bit like a meteor hitting Earth. It happens, but then everyone moves away from it, or an explosion or something like that. So those don't tend to be the same kind of communicability. And I have a hard time impressing this on people, because I'm seeing patients right now, and people still in 2023 now are, when they test positive for COVID, they still have this reckoning or this imagination that it's original COVID, and it has mutated. It's a kitty cat to compare to the, if in fact the first one was a lion, which I'm only going to stipulate for the sake of argument, but I don't believe it was. But if the first one was a lion, this one is not. This one's, a little kitty cat can certainly scratch and bite you and hurt you, and if you're frail enough, it can get you. But in general, it's not. So, and not only that, but Omicron is not genomically related to that cat. So there have been other cats around that are not necessarily a descendant of that original one. Anyway, so that was, I apologize for that little diatribe.
No, it's fine. No, I think it raises an interesting question, which is, when did the spread actually commence? I asked there, and there's sort of two avenues of thought I would like to discuss briefly there. The first one is the evidence for earlier spread of something SARS-CoV-2 like. And let's call it actually earlier spread of SARS-CoV-2. And that comes from a number of countries, and also from the perspective of geospatial analysis, when we look at the micro level geographic dispersion of the early cases, for example, by county in the United Kingdom, we see no evidence for viral spread. What we see evidence for is the spread of PCR testing into an existing prevalence across the country. And that's very interesting, because what happens is it's only when the measures start that the mortality begins, the excess mortality. Prior to the measures, there was no excess mortality. Nobody had noticed any deaths and dying. So that leads me to believe that it was, in fact, the measures that caused the complications more so than the virus. This is not the same as saying that the virus never killed anybody, of course, because viruses routinely take out elderly people. But
so that's a very subtle point. I think what I'm hearing you say is that the widespread testing brought about kind of a mismatch between cases of fatalities and so forth, which might have been from other causes or from the lockdown of the measures or depression or suicide, whatever, and kind of a spread and misattribution of those to the virion. Am I doing that correctly or no?
if you PCR testing willy-nilly, you're going to pick up positive cases. Some of those will be ones that end in death and so on. But at the same time, if you're driving a whole lot of changes to the way in which clinical practice normally proceeds, if you're isolating patients, moving old people around, suspending the use of antibiotics, which was a very strange move that the World Health Organization took early on. The standard of care, didn't include the things that you normally would use to treat a severely comorbid person who's struggling with a respiratory virus. And it's probably those changes to clinical practice and hospital management in particular that caused the mortality more so than.
Okay, so it's not. I'm a little bit off. So you're saying just their management approach changed kind of by, in a sense, aggrandizing the enemy, falsely aggrandizing the enemy, and then they steered away from some potential practices by perhaps acting rote and lockstep to treat something by not necessarily the most efficacious manners.
Yeah. So, and just remind me where your question started, because I said I had two streams of thought, and I've now kind of lost my focus on your original question.
Oh gosh, we're going to have to maybe lay that aside till we rewind.
Okay. Yeah.
But
so we were talking about origin, and I said you got to ask the question: when did this thing actually emerge? But there's a deeper question as well. I've remembered now. The deeper question is whether there really has been a novel addition to the suite of respiratory viruses that cause severe illness in some people. And that's a question which you can take from the perspective of the early pre-existing immunity studies, which all came out showing that upwards of 80% of any population that you looked at had pre-existing immunity to.
Yeah, I think there was also some studies showing that in East Asia, there were higher background immune levels than in, say, the United States or Europe, which would indicate some endemic aspect to this type of coronavirus.
And also, if you remember that the Diamond Princess ship.
Yeah.
That story was very interesting. It was quite clear that this thing did very little to people.
No, I understand. I think that if you had say Bruce Wayne instead of Bill Gates, I don't know if you're a Batman fan, say the good billionaire, somebody would have buoyed this and made sure that everyone heard about the Diamond Princess, because I think it's like almost literally $100 billion experiment. Yeah. If you wanted to get 3,711 people together on some quarantined boat in the middle of the water or whatever, of all different ages and wealthy people, plus staff workers and whatnot, so a reasonable demographic spread, and then say, oh, we're gonna infect you with this novel virus, you would have to pay everyone $10 million a piece. It would be literally a multi-billion-dollar affair to have this experiment. It was done early. It was done in January 2020, and the results were reasonably well studied. They were out there, and there were, I think, ultimately 11 deaths, median age 82, from that occasion. But
it was 14 eventually.
The crew, which were young people, probably in their 20s, they had no idea that even it was a virus. And practically, they had no symptoms and so forth. The kids had Zippo. They had nothing, and this is all there. If I had been Elon Musk at the right moment, having purchased Twitter or whatever, I would have this pasted nonstop, and it was completely ignored. I mean, almost nobody amongst my medical cohort and cohort of doctor friends really knows anything about this. I mean, it's just totally it's a lacuna in medical knowledge, and I think it's amazing, because that is the it's not quite perfect, but it's not a genuine experiment, but it's very, very close.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because the Diamond Princess was always in my early presentations, which started in early May 2020. I would always lead in with the Diamond Princess, because this was, it was initially reported widely, as this very dramatic story of the ocean-going ship with a deadly virus on board. And then when it emerged that nobody had died, of course, the entire story was dropped. It's not that nobody died. 14 people in the end did die. But that, as you said, 14 out of 4,000 odd. And so this wasn't what it was cracked up to be. And I eventually kind of dropped it from the presentation when I felt that most of the audiences I was talking to had accepted this perspective that SARS-CoV-2 was not a deadly virus. And it's very interesting for me to hear you say now that amongst the doctors you converse with, there is still a low level of awareness of the diamond princess phenomenon.
Yeah, no, I had these email chains. So I'm a squash and tennis player, and so I belong to a squash and tennis club, and actually a second tennis club. But they closed the tennis courts. Outdoor. We had outdoor courts, and they closed the tennis courts. And and then so I was like, so I started, and we have professors and kind of the coterie of people you might expect. And I kind of these people I like. These are my friends.
Yeah.
And so I wound up having these email chains, and it got very vituperative. I was pretty much cast out. I'm still there as a member, but there was a lot of anger. I had, I was assault is a tricky word, but I was accosted at the very least. I was talking in private conversation with a mother, who this is probably a year after the whole thing, when the vaccines were coming out, and she had her 9-year-old playing on the court over there. We were just chatting quietly. And she was like, well, my vaccine. I said, well, the vaccine is a wonderful thing, and vaccines in general are wonderful things, but they need to be targeted for the right people. And I said, the example I always use is, yellow fever vaccine exists. It's a great thing, but I have never taken it. I have no anticipation of taking it. If I wound up going to, I don't know, Nigeria or something like that, maybe I would, or I don't know where yellow fever is, but
exactly. I'd take a yellow fever vaccine.
There's a right moment for it, and I don't think your 9-year-old, in light of the fact, the 9-year-old probably already had the illness, and then the 9-year-olds don't in general, blah blah blah. So you know what I would have said. And this guy, I've only seen him once. It turns out he's an MD, MPH, he's in public health, whatever. He and I'm not joking. He came in screaming as if there had been a fire, or if I were mutilating something. He came screaming at me. And I've never met him before in my life. And so it was a quiet little, couch living room affair. We have a lounge, as it were, and he started screaming, and he just didn't stop. And it was like, I'm basically killing people, risking lives by having this conversation with a mom. And, I wasn't doing medical care for her. I told her she has to talk to her own doctor, blah, 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 and she'll do whatever she's going to do. And I'm sure she's gotten the vaccine for the kid in the meanwhile. But it's just the kind of the amplitude, and I don't know. That was obviously I'm scarred.
Yeah.
I have PTSD.
Yeah, I got you. The only thing I would say is, I often muse over the huge favor that all of this hysteria around COVID has done to people like me, because what's happened is my very broad social and commercial network has suffered enormous casualties, but it's only of the credulous and cowardly people. And so, it's kind of done me a huge favor. It's winnowed down, given me space to make new connections amongst the intelligent and brave.
Yeah. Ditto here, not to the pluralist.
Much improved.
Yeah. No, it's a funny thing. It's Harry Potter has the sorting hat, and you wind up in I don't know which. I got to remember the colleges now, but you wind up in the appropriate residential housing group, the college that you want, I guess. And so we have had a morphing of our friend group, and I've also had the same kind of I don't know if you ever saw the movie The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, when they suss out an actual still thinking human. They look like humans. They've been taken over by pods, alien pods, And when they see an actual human, they can sense it, and they start, they do this high-pitched scream and pointing because they don't have words. I think it's, is it an allegory for our times? I don't know. I'll leave it out there.
Yeah, I like that one. I haven't actually seen the movie. I'm not a big
I don't know if the
consumer
original
of
one,
media.
like the 60s. It had a big effect on me when I saw it in college in the 70s. Maybe it's a 70s movie. I don't know. But people on campus, after this movie came out, college kids being what they are, every now and then you just be walking along and some guy would be, and I can't do this high-pitched scream because it's going to kill our listeners. But people would do this on campus and point to each other and shriek. It was pretty funny for a while. And it turns out that that it's true.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to ask you a little bit about the nudge,
okay,
and psychological nudging, and when it's appropriate, when it's not. I was watching one of these YouTube documentaries on, I think it's the Norden bomb site, and it's a World War II apparatus that helped. Before we had smart bombs, we had dumb bombs, and this was basically a peripheral brain to help the flyers drop the bomb in the right place, depending on weather, speed, wind, all this kind of stuff. So it has kind of a couple different gyros in it, and anyways, it's a kind of an analog computer, and everyone knew that this thing was awesome and was a top secret, and people were told to guard it literally with their lives. And if they came down, they had to destroy it. Anyway, in the aftermath, so it turns out it didn't actually work that well. But nobody since has ever been able to talk about it because it provided the ethos and the spirit, and to quote you, the thumos of the war, this kind of motivating concept that the bombers knew they had something special. And it kept them, being able to. When they looked at the data, the accuracy using this Norden bomb site was really not much better than random, and probably potentially lives were wasted, and potentially they were over aggressive in what they did because they insisted on doing daylight bombing because they had this device. They did daylight bombing, whereas they had been previously going at night and using grids and coordinates. So now they need to see their target. And they got shot out of the sky. So there were higher fatalities amongst the airmen, young men, not from myocarditis, but from getting shot at. But there was nudge, essentially. There was a whole psyops to keep everyone under the concept that this thing was the most awesomest thing ever, because it would provide fear to the enemy. It's a little bit of a stretch, and it's a recent analogy I just came up with, but. What was the nudge going on? Was it effective? Is it still? How do we anti-nudge? And what are your thoughts about the whole concept?
Yeah, I mean, I often think about the ethics of nudging, and I guess I start off with the thought that whether we like it or not, we human beings are relentless and very effective manipulators, and it's what you want is to be manipulated by smart, honest, and independent people with a good ethical basis. That's the most we can ask for, because we are all manipulated and we manipulate. And it's a fine line between many of these constructs: nudging, propaganda, marketing, influence. You've got lots of gray area. I have often felt uncomfortable in board meetings discussing consumer goods and advertising and brand management strategies that are used to get people to buy those items. You look at them and say, but there's really nothing special about this item. It's no different from the guy around the corner with the other logo. You're actually selling, trying to convince somebody that their lives are going to improve, or that they can have this magical association, which will give them various social benefits. And that stuff, which is, I mean, everybody knows that's the game being played. It's not like the consumer doesn't understand that Adidas and Nike are
Yeah, but there's a competition there.
Sorry.
And presumably, Puma can say Adidas sucks, and vice versa, and they're brothers who are feuding, and they're probably both right. But there's a competition out there, so ultimately you can source and divide it up and figure out what you want to do. In this case, it seems to have been very much top down, boot on the neck approach.
Yes, and we had the behavioral science teams in governments who were putting together the government commercials and print and media and television commercials, but we also had nudge strategies inside the social media companies who were managing news feeds and advertising and so on across their entire databases of users. It's another type of nudging. My feeling is that it's far more harm than good. I would rather see the practice of nudging severely restricted. If you had some way of detecting and punishing it when it happens, then I think that would be a virtuous thing to have in the world. I don't think that psychological manipulation should be the first point of departure when you're trying to convince somebody that something is in their own interests.
Right. So I think it's always a matter of degree. I think the Norden bomb site, to get back to this recent example, was happening in the context of, say, an existential war, the Nazis taking over Europe or not. And I think everyone's always looking for kind of the equivalence of war. I think people more on the left and the right have a nostalgia for this time when we're all kind of marching in lockstep. And I think the socialist ethos, in a sense, is everybody marching toward the future. Kind of, if you think of Soviet realist artwork and so forth, we're all kind of bonded together. We need some cause. We need a cause that will help us forget our own individual needs and interests and so forth. And so I think that's been lacking because we haven't. I mean, thank God we have not had, unless you count the Cold War, we haven't had really World War III yet. And so everything becomes the equivalent of war. Climate change is the war on drugs, say earlier, the war on poverty, and I guess poverty lost and drugs have won as well. But I think there's this mistake that this SARS-2 could have been the thing we all bond together around the world. And I think for it was a political divide. I don't mean to just say everybody on the left, but grossly it was the left versus the right. People, who want everyone to kind of join together under a global edict and whatnot, versus say those more with individual spirits, or following, say, more older religious dogma of personal choice and freedom and whatnot. Anyway, that's not much of a question, but let's just get back to you for a second. What motivated you? What gave you strength to kind of have this compass and have the sensibility that things might not be exactly as they were promoted?
Look, I mean, my primary motivation at the beginning was very much an ethical stance. I felt that I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I, knowing what I knew, I simply sat by and did nothing and said nothing. I had a little moment of crisis. They extended over a couple of days before I decided to speak out, and wasn't sleeping and so on. And the moment I began to speak out, from then I never lost sleep again, and I felt a lot better and have never regretted doing it. But I'm also the kind of person I have intense curiosity, and so I've never been short of stimulation. I've learned a great deal. I've met some wonderful people through the movement. And my personal network has been enhanced dramatically even commercially. And that has been a win. I've got new friends, and that became I guess, a sustaining factor. I also have a little bit of, I guess it's a feeling of, being irate is the wrong term. It's like a little bit of, my Greek is escaping me. It's the word for rage. But when the people who have come at me, told lies about me in the media, smeared, censored, and so on. Brought professionalism complaints against me and that kind of thing. I find a fight. I take them on, and I never let go. I'm just that kind of person. I don't back off. When I was a young man, that caused problems in relationships because I didn't know how to walk away from petty conflict. That took some growing up to get rid of that. But that's also just that sort of tendency to dig in and fight.
That's an important thing.
Yeah.
I don't seek out fights. I'm not I'm a lover, not a fighter. I got to say, but I wrestled when I was in high school, and I didn't really think much about it. I mostly did it because my older brother had started, and he was coming home and beating me up regularly. And so when my turn came, I had to take wrestling to kind of equalize after my annus horribilis, his first year of doing wrestling. So, and I didn't really come up with much, reason or cause for it. But the few times I've been physically threatened, it kind of came in handy. People are expecting you to box, and if you start doing wrestling, I've had people down pretty quick, and but it's like, I don't look for fights per se, but I mean, maybe I do. I have to ask my therapist. He's not here, and I don't actually have one, but I could ask my wife, I guess. And she, so we had this little, moment the other day where she's like, "Stop doing this, stop. You just want a chew toy. You want something." And I don't think that's quite it. I think that there are injustices out there. I actually, I'm redoing. I'm back in clinical practice, and everyone's being forced by the state still in 2023 to wear masks throughout. So if you come in for your elbow and nobody's sick, I saw a kid who's like 10 years old and the dad, 30x years old, and nobody's ill. And we're all wearing masks. He hurt his elbow. It's just kind of a weird thing. So you contravene the law if you want to suggest, maybe this is not the thing we have to do. But, I think people have a great relief when you bring up, the emperor's new clothes being no clothes. And it's a very, and not only, as far as the medicine part goes, I think there's a kind of like you talked about the risk benefit. Everyone's wearing masks, so we're not going to get Omicron, which is kind of a common cold, say, whatever, maybe if that works. But on the other hand, we're missing all the visual cues that we get from having our entire face. And I've tried to learn how to read whether eyes are smiling or whatever. But when you see somebody and you talk to somebody, it's a totally different occasion. And I think the important part is to impart the message, if you believe in your medical message, to the patient. And I don't think they take it on in whole cloth. There's a whole cloth.
That's a good point. Very good point. I think that's true, and I think it's also true that one of the things we've learned in the last couple of years is that all of our emperors have no clothes.
Yeah. Well, I like yours, and I know you're on vacation. And
the last day.
Yeah, and so I don't want to we've kind of hit the little beyond the 45-minute mark. So I want to give you the opportunity to, have a last word and self-endorsement. I'm going to have a last word after that. We can stick around for a minute to chat. But tell us a little bit about how people can follow you, what the message is, where they can kind of get up to speed on some of the things that you're proposing.
Yeah, so the website is www.pandata.org, pandata.org. And our social media handle is Panda19, Panda19. And I think it's also worth mentioning our Substack, which is called Panda Uncut. I've long ago been suspended on Twitter. My ideas were far too dangerous for them. And I'm still waiting for Elon's team to reinstate me. I'll be back as soon as I'm reinstated. But
what would be your Twitter handle once?
Mine is at Nick Hudson CT, CT being for Cape Town. I had a dormant account with about 2 followers prior to COVID, and resurrected that, and when I was banned, it had about 70,000 followers. I hopefully will be back within days. I might also mention, I don't know how quickly this video is going to go out, but on Sunday there's going to be a very exciting Twitter Spaces event discussing issues related to censorship and freedom of expression.
Yeah.
We've got some really big name people coming out onto that. And if you look at the Panda Twitter feed, Pandata 19, you will find details of that.
Is this by Knopfel? That guy, well, I guess his last name is like awful with an N, Knopfel. Is that his Twitter Spaces or your own?
No, this one is going out under the handle of the person who's sort of handling the technical aspects of the event, because it's quite a large scale event, and her name is Gal G. But the event is being advertised on a wide range of platforms.
And what's it going to be called? I mean, how do people find it?
So as I say, the best way is to just go and look at the recent posts on the Panda Twitter feed.
Okay, fair enough.
Right.
So I'm going to let you go. I'm going to give my own last shameless self-promotion. This is my weighty tome. This is Overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was. So I started working on this before COVID-19 was a thing. I started working in 2019, before anyone knew anything about coronavirus coming around. And I had just as a quick summary. I had a short article that I just thought it weird that it was there, and everyone was like, Zika, microcephaly. And you know, if in fact it's true, it's a horrible, horrible thing. And they ultimately predicted 1 million extra microcephalic births per year, and with, you know, diminished cognition and so forth, horrible tragedies. And then there was nothing. And so that was like 2015, 2016. When 2019 came along, I was puzzled about it. I wrote an 800-word article, and that was it. I just kind of sent it out to everybody. And I got a response from JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. I wound up on a Zoom call with the erstwhile editors, chief editors, Bauschner and Livingston, the two top medical editors, and we were doing this kind of thing. And they were like, Livingston said, wow, you know, this is very impressive work, very interesting, fascinating, and I'd love to publish this. I was like, yeah, you know, my little brain was like, oh, and then he said, but, you know, COVID-19 is on the horizon here, and it was early 2020, and we don't want to sow any doubt in the public health establishment, so we're going to take a pass. And I said, well, I mean, I'm sure I didn't say this as pithily, but I said basically, oh, I'm sorry, my mistake. I thought you guys were a medical journal, not a propaganda. Well, I said basically that. I said, I thought, you know, I think I don't think it helps the public health establishment if you take everything, to get back to that whole term, whole cloth. I think you have to look at things, you know, they're right about some things, they're wrong about other things. And I think everyone as adults, presumably, that needs to hear about stuff from them. And if you don't take things, you know, if they can't admit their mistakes, how are you going to believe when they're saying the next thing that they don't ever, you know, hold responsibility? And so they're like, yeah.
The assumption of infallibility has never been correct.
Yeah. So they're like, yeah, no. Thank you, goodbye. And that was it. So I'm not sure what the technical term for pissed off is, but I was pissed off. I don't know if you use that term. I was irritated, and whatever the Greek word for rage, we'll have to look that up later. So I had the Greek word for rage, and I said, you know what? I just have to circumvent this establishment. And I said, I'm just going to do, and I wound up doing more and more research. The more I kind of pulled on the cloth, you know, getting back to the emperor and his no clothes and so forth, I found there was very little there. And you know, so Jay Bhattacharya has actually, you know, read my stuff, and he gave it a thumbs up on Twitter, which I am very much in his debt. Anyway, so that's my spiel, as they say. So I'm going to let you go.
Thanks very much, Randy. It's been great chatting, and I'll see you, no doubt, in some of the open side.
Right, and I'm very much in your debt for having started Pandata, and I think peripherally, and by extension, many other people, you know, millions around the world, have benefited from the concepts and from the espousal of same and the bravery. So that we are very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Randy. Okay, go well.